first of all, just let me say a couple of things. I'm going to be really, really strict about timing. And the reason I'm going to be really, really strict about timing is because I know I can see this room is crowded. I know that a lot of people are going to have things that they want to say. And this is about having a discussion, getting as many voices in as possible. That means we have to keep a grip on the timing. I'll also get shouted at by Claire if we finish late or anything like that. So if you're speaking from the audience, you've got 90 seconds, which is around about 200 words, which is quite a lot, actually. If you're getting towards 90 seconds, I'll wave that. And what you do is you just finish your sentence. So think about what you're going to say when you make a point. Don't go off on a tangent. Make a sharp, hard-hitting point. And if you see that, it is time just to sit down and let someone else have a go at it. So I'm going to announce our panel in the order that they'll speak. It is, as I say, a really good panel to help us through an area that is a bit of a minefield, to be honest, in today's world. And first of all, here on my immediate left, we have James Marriott, who's a columnist of The Times, and he's the author of the extremely good Cultural Capital Substack, which I really recommend you sign up to. After James, sitting on my immediate right, is Nicole. I'm going to say it in French, Lampert, but it's not that. But there you go. It says living in Brussels too long. She is a journalist and a commentator on anti-Semitism, Israel, feminism, pretty difficult topics. She's everywhere at the moment, works amazingly hard, judging by Facebook and Substack. And she's got guts. After Nicole, we have Michael Murphy here on my intermediate right. He's a journalist and documentary filmmaker who again tackles very difficult, contested topics and debates such as immigration or life on Israel's home front. And again, I recommend you look him up on Substack. Then we have on my far right, positionally, we have Sonia Gallego, who works for Al Jazeera's English service. She's an immensely experienced reporter, over 2 decades on sort of frontline stories from Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America. And last but not least, on my far left is Professor Frank Furedi, sociologist, social commentator, prolific author, and his last book, War on the Past, is well worth a read, and of course his on Substack too. So, James, please kick us off. You've got 6 to 7 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. The position I'm going to set out, I think, may seem almost perversely unpopular. Is this microphone sort of popping?
No,
is that just me?
It will pick you up.
Okay, good. So my position is basically a defense of the idea of a liberal elite. Am I too close?
Yeah,
is that what I'm doing wrong? I think one of the most interesting analyses of the current turbulent state of our public discourse was made by the political scientist Brian Klaas, who pointed out that the unique thing about the communications revolution of social media is that where all previous communications revolutions had expanded the reach of the means of communication, print allowed text to proliferate much more widely through society. Social media is really the first communications revolution that has democratized access to the production of information. To get into print before social media was pretty hard. The levels of education and the levels of connection within the publishing industry were quite hard to achieve if you wanted to get your voice into print. On social media, everyone can speak, and it's really, I think, the most democratic moment in the production of information in history. On the surface, this seems like a good thing. We think that the more people who speak, the better. We live in a democratic society, and we're inclined to think that more democracy is always a good thing. I think actually it's been a catastrophe, and it turns out, I think, that the more people who are allowed to speak is not the better. A more democratic public discourse is not a better one, and I think it now seems to me that the situation we had in the decades after the Second World War, in which the flow of information in society was controlled by what we might now call a cultural or a liberal elite, may have been, I think, almost the ideal information network in society. People are groaning at me, and I know this is an unpopular position, and I'm by no means an uncritical supporter of the idea of a liberal elite. I'm very far from thinking the BBC is perfect. Even the Times newspaper may not be totally perfect, although in their choice of columnists is pretty spot on. But I think a liberal elite as a means of controlling information in society is the worst option, except for all the others, as Churchill said about democracy. One of the, I think in hindsight, extraordinary things about the way that information worked in society before social media was that to participate in the production of information, you had to sign up to what now strike us, I think, as fairly stringent criteria. If you wanted to speak on the BBC or in the newspapers, you had to have some commitment to objective truth. You had to have some commitment to science and reason. And you had to have some commitment to the liberal values of tolerance and free speech. I think what we're seeing on social media is that commitment to truth and liberal values do not remotely arise spontaneously from a population of people when they're all thrown together in a great big, as Twitter likes to call itself sometimes, town square. I think liberal values and rational values are, in terms of human nature, profoundly counterintuitive. And I think if we want those values in society, to some degree they have to be imposed on us. I don't think people behave in a liberal and rational way when left to themselves. So I think, although it seems, I know, unpopular and mad to say, and it's a position that I've arrived at with more reluctance than enthusiasm, it requires, elite is a kind of provocative word for it, but I think information has to be distributed through society, ideally through a class of experts. We don't want that class of expert to be hereditary or select on the grounds of economic privilege. I think meritocracy is a pretty good system, but if you want a rational, liberal society, I think you need an expert class who control the flow of information and control discourse to some degree. I also think the sort of minimum possible argument for a cultural elite is not even necessarily that they produce a superior standard of discourse. I think in hindsight it's pretty clear we did when you compare the level of truth you get on the average BBC News broadcast to the level of truth you get on a Joe Rogan podcast, and the commitment to science the BBC has compared to the commitment to science of the average Twitter commentator. I think that standard of discourse was actually really remarkably higher. I think the minimum possible argument for a liberal elite, though, doesn't even hinge on the superiority of the discourse produced by a cultural elite, but I think hinges more on the fact that if you're to have a successful democratic nation state, it's necessary for all the inhabitants of that nation state to share the same reality. We'll have to have the same view of reality. And if we have the 1,000 shattered competing realities that are produced by social media, I think it's proving pretty clear that that's not a really workable way to run a society. I've got a minute. Basically finished now. So, yeah, that's my kind of minimum possible argument for the idea that information should come from a shared source that we all have access to. Is that if we don't inhabit a shared reality, we end up with chaos, and that is, I think, the very minimum thing you can say that the BBC and the newspapers provided. I'm not saying that. I'm very far from saying they're perfect. I'm no particular enthusiast for a liberal elite, but as I say, my case is, for all its terrible flaws, for all its smugness, for all its snootiness, it's the worst option except for all the others. Maybe worth finishing with a quote from that unlikely elitist Superhands in Peep Show. Said, "You can't trust people, Jazz. People like Coldplay and voted for the Nazis."
Nicole.
Hi. Can you hear me? Yeah. I wanted to be a journalist since the age of 9. Mostly it was because I was extremely nosy, some might call inquisitive. But there was a small part of me who, inspired by both Watergate and Lois Lane, wanted to make the world a bit better, because that's what I thought journalists did, spoke truth to power. So it saddens me to be here talking about the horrendous misinformation and deliberate disinformation that we see in our media on a daily basis. I'd argue that it doesn't just corrode our society, but it makes it more dangerous. And as a Jewish journalist, I feel very much at the front line of that. I'm going to talk about media misinformation in terms of the Israel-Gaza war, probably the most hotly debated topic today. There are so many examples of media disinformation in this war that I could talk about them for the entire session, but don't worry, I won't. At the start of the week, we witnessed something that was quite miraculous, the return of all the living hostages from Hamas captivity. But when I turned on the television news to see how they were reporting it, my euphoria, as someone who has interviewed many of the hostage families, turned to fury. On Sky, the reporter started talking about how the hostages were being released to the hospitals to meet their families. I know from my own reporting that many of them spend months there under the care of doctors with complex issues after up to 2 years of being starved, tortured, shackled and kept in cages underground. The reporter moaned that the prisoners from the Palestinian prisoners who were returning to Gaza wouldn't have a hospital to go to because they had all been destroyed by the war. That's patent and unashamed misinformation or lies. Over on the BBC, they featured the crying sister of a Palestinian prisoner. It was a terribly emotional piece about the cruelty of Israel, which had, in the words of the sister, kept her brother as a hostage for 20 years. It was only mentioned as if in passing at the very end that he was a terrorist who had been jailed for the murder of 4 Israelis during the Second Intifada. This isn't confined to our shores. CNN's Christiane Amanpour had to apologise after first saying that she believed it could be likely that the Israeli hostages may have been treated than many Gazan prisoners. She was asking us to ignore what the entire world has seen over the past 2 years. Emaciated, starved figures who can barely walk, celebratory ceremonies over the coffins of babies who were taken from their home and strangled alongside their mother. What we are seeing is activist journalism in favour of Islamic extremism. Journalism requires sieving information. As journalists, we always have more facts and quotes than we can possibly ever fit into an article or TV segment. That when we deliberately omit key facts, then that becomes disinformation. This became particularly clear when Israel temporarily withdrew humanitarian aid from Gaza. Now, I believe this was a cruel policy, and we can certainly debate that, although I can also understand why it was done, to pressure Hamas into caving in. But barely any reports revealed that before the siege started, during one of the ceasefires, an extra 6 months of aid had been sent into Gaza. So there should have been enough food. Reports started to come out via Hamas that people were starving, and journalists were desperate to illustrate this. And so we had a succession of photographs being used in newspapers ranging from the Daily Express to the Star to the New York Times of starved children. But the problem was that every single one of these horribly emaciated children had underlying sicknesses that meant their bodies were rejecting the food that they were being given. The picture captions from the photo agencies accompanying these photographs usually explained that this was going on, that these were sick children. But both the British newspapers and the New York Times deliberately left that information out. This is a version of fake stories to fit an agenda. And the agenda is that Zionists deliberately kill babies, that we are baby killers. This is the blood libel. Another key issue left out of reporting on this conflict is the fact that 900 IDF soldiers, most of the young men, have been killed during this conflict. No wonder people bark on about genocide when they only hear about one side dying. And of course, there is the omission of the fact that Hamas is a terrorist group and should be called as such. Instead, some of our liberal elite treat them as if they are honest freedom fighters. One final and perhaps most famous example of the deliberate omission of the facts was in the BBC documentary about life in Gaza, as seen through the eye of the children. It was only through the work of blogger David Collier, so alternative media, that it emerged that one of these children was the child of a Hamas official. It's led to a huge fuss, obviously. But when this emerged, astonishingly, the BBC tried to ride this out by continuing to play the show until there was a huge fuss, and then it gave itself a slap on the wrist. The head of the BBC News, Deborah Turness, even tried to excuse it by saying it was important to remember the distinction between the military and political wings of Hamas, even though the British government says there is no distinction, and it was the political wing which directed the October 7 attack. Only yesterday, the Ofcom gave the BBC a sanction for this propaganda documentary, calling it materially misleading, and the BBC was forced to apologise. The cumulative effect is to ruin the image of neutrality of the BBC in particular. The historian Professor Richard Landers calls the way the Israel-Palestine war is reported lethal journalism. It is dangerous, and I believe that the BBC in particular is one of the pre-propagators of anti-Semitism. But it's also dangerous for our entire society, not just because we lose trust in what is fact and what is fiction, but also because so much of the reporting on this particular issue asks us to ignore who and what Hamas are, that they are Islamic terrorists who dream of fulfilling the demands of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is first to destroy Israel and then the West. And so we should not be surprised that a cynical audience looks at that and thinks they must find an alternative where they can find the truth.
Thank you. Michael.
Hello. I would like to be the Martin Luther to James's high clergy this morning. In 2005, the American author Saul Bellow, I think, perfectly summed up our information landscape when he wrote a collection of essays titled "There is Simply Too Much to Think About." I'm sure many of you find that relatable. Objectively, it had never been more true. In 2001, 4 years prior, university researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, had set out to figure out in data bits exactly how much information had been produced that year. They found that more information had been generated than in all of previous human existence. In fact, it was double that number. The following year, in 2002, it was double that number again and has since been growing exponentially. Over the past quarter century, the number of internet users has increased tenfold, now numbering 6 billion people. One way to understand the effects of this information tsunami is to consider the laws of supply and demand. The author Martin Gurri, in his book Revolt of the Elites, noted that as Wait, okay. Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Feel like we're in a submarine there. That as the sources of information increased, the sort of perceived quality of those sources decreased. And coinciding with this online revolution, the traditional sources of authority, media, government, and academia, were undergoing a transition of their own. Excuse me. It is now well documented that in the years after the so-called Great Awakening in 2013, and probably many decades before, that they became, on the whole, more preachy, more censorious, less tolerant of dissenting views. This coincidence meant the authorities became more dogmatic, just as the opportunities for skepticism became functionally infinite. The institutions themselves were degraded, moving away from objectivity and meritocracy and towards dogmas around race and gender in particular. while the barriers to compete with them, to offer counterpoints, and to mock their sacred cows dropped to near zero. Now, has this been a good thing? I would argue yes. I agree with James that if you were to pick a New York Times article and pluck out at random a Joe Rogan episode, you would likely find that the New York Times article is more rigorously sourced and more factual. But I don't think we should or can choose one or the other. The first point to make is a practical one. After the invention of the Gutenberg printing press, it set in motion a cascade of events, including the Reformation, the wars of religion, the founding of the modern state, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution, and so on. None of the former hierarchies, from the Catholic Church to the Russian Tsars, could put the genie back in the bottle. They could only play whack-a-mole. And that's the situation I think we're in. Second, if it were possible for the old authorities to censor social media or provide some kind of informational bottleneck through which they can be the trusted commissars of truth, I think that might temporarily earn them back some power, but not authority, in the sense of rebuilding the trust of those who understandably have become skeptical of them. I think this approach also lacks epistemic humility. It presumes we know, or are able to know in advance, which words will be apt or correct in a given situation. No man or machine has that level of omniscience, and we should be very skeptical of those who claim to have it, and those who would elect themselves to be censors. Those advocating for this would ideally point to whom they would entrust with the responsibility to decide for the rest of us what we may read, see, or hear. Should we look to the British state, which arrests Irish comedy writers and up to 30 people per day in this country for online remarks that some people might find offensive or anxiety-inducing? Or perhaps their European counterparts, who seem to believe that misinformation is whatever they say it is. Or maybe a young tech worker in Silicon Valley who has likely been recruited from one of the most anxious and authoritarian generations America has ever produced. Pick your poison. The power to censor others is like Tolkien's ring. Few who wield it have made it out uncorrupted. The free online environment also allows us to gauge exactly how free we actually are. When the comedy writer Graham Linehan was arrested by 5 armed policemen for making a joke about a transgender in a women's bathroom, a newspaper likely wouldn't have run it. It was, by some accounts, quite distasteful. But the fact that he was able to self-publish tells us that that is the response of the British state. That is how free we are. Anyway, I just lastly, our old liberal hierarchies and their broadly liberal vision have led us into one disaster after another, from foreign misadventures to declining birth rates to demographic change, which has been imposed on European peoples from on high. And their hold on the organs of information production have only emboldened them to go further than they might otherwise have gone. Thank you.
Sonia, please.
Okay. All right. Hope that's okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Good.
Great.
Not too close.
Not too close? Fine. Okay. First of all, I want to thank James Marriott for pointing out again, underlining the point that a successful democracy can't survive without, thank you, without a shared sense of reality. And he's right, of course. But I also want to talk about how reality faces many challenges these days. And that isn't just because of tinfoil hat conspiracists on Telegram. It's been quietly throttled by the very people paid to protect it. And that's within newsrooms. Now, we've got this problem of swinging cuts to newsroom budgets. News gathering itself has been affected by this. And in its place has mushroomed a dependency on institutions, NGOs, and clever-sounding tech that promises efficiency, but in reality delivers a bland conformity. Also, rolling news has made it worse with this endless carousel of talking heads, seemingly adding to the deluge of voices and the overload of information to which Michael has referred to. Now, having had the privilege of starting out my TV career in the US networks and seeing the world through that prism, it was refreshing, but the default setting was naturally the most powerful nation on earth, the United States. If it doesn't involve America, it doesn't exist. Now, I want to steer to one particular episode that I think was absolutely seismic and really drew a line under public trust in media. I believe that our current problem with lack of trust in institutions can be traced, in my view, to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The truth became a casualty of that war before it even began. The invasion was treated as a foregone conclusion, a sort of patriotic inevitability on both sides of the Atlantic. The press appeared to play along, and there seemed to be a sort of impartial or letting go of impartiality traded for access when military embeds were touted as the only way of being guaranteed a piece of the action. They have their place, of course, but the problem is that the dependence upon that has made it very difficult to maintain objectivity and see different perspectives, which was very much needed in that conflict, as with all conflicts. Elsewhere, there were alternative outlets that popped up to challenge Western views. A noble enough pursuit, but moral righteousness soon becomes its own narcotic, in my view. Truth is never so fragile as when a journalist believes, in all seriousness, that they're on the right side of history. Remind you of anyone? When weapons of mass destruction, when the fantasy imploded, so did any illusion that we were independent from the powers that be. That conflict forged a brave new world of the post-truth era. If you remember the Mirror's front page showing a faked-up photo of an Iraqi prisoner purportedly being abused, and that's what got Piers Morgan sacked. There were forged documents. There were imaginary consignments of yellow cake in Niger. There were also weapons of mass destruction that would only take 45 minutes to chemically eviscerate us all. And there was a whole generation that was then formed that decided to never trust a government briefing again. Now, luckily, for those behind those briefings, the podcast world provides a handsome salary and an opportunity to launder reputations. Alistair Campbell. So what better to face the post-truth world than artificial intelligence? It can summarize, translate, fabricate authority at a terrifying speed, and used well, it is a brilliant tool. But used badly, it is an enabler of the worst kind of poltroonism that is seen in the newsrooms, run by managers who worship efficiency. The instinct to doubt the journalist's real skill is being replaced by a faith in the machine. Now, the old gatekeepers also haven't gone away. Nepotism still decides who gets in, who gets ahead, who's invited to the right sort of dinners. Newsrooms that boast of diversity are somehow filled with great minds that think alike. The result? Blind spots everywhere. Disinformation units are busily chasing meme accounts, while genuine scandals say the Tavistock are sliding quietly off the desks. Now, nowhere is this cowardice more obvious than the coverage of immigration. On the front lines of this continent's migration crisis, Southern Europe, the Balkans, North Africa, Turkey, where trafficking networks operate with impunity. But the well-thinking bien-pensants back home who boast of eclectic dining choices on their high street and their Eastern European cleaners will find an incomplete picture of what is behind open borders policies, because there is little challenge of that in liberal media. In Turkey or the Middle East, immigration is treated quite bluntly. In Europe, moral discomfort mutes debate, leading to a widening in the gap in trust. Now, what is called compassionate is swiftly accomplished by refusal to discuss it further. And when the stories people live don't match the stories we tell, they stop believing us as journalists. Take the Bell Hotel in Epping, where residents protesting asylum housing were instantly dismissed as misinformed bigots. True, there were some people who were taking advantage of a fraught situation, but many weren't. And the contempt from the press of that moral superiority was an embarrassment for our profession. Part of this is financial, strapped for cash and plagued by rolling news deadlines. But in my view, the answer isn't another layer of editorial bureaucracy or yet more AI fact-checking. Hannah Arendt warned that when everyone lies, the danger isn't belief in the lie, but the disbelief in everything. And we already may be halfway there.
Right. I think it's important to get a bit of historical perspective, because there's a danger of just living in the present and ignoring the fact that almost every problem that's been raised here has been a recurring one for a long, long, long time. So the idea of there is too much to think about, which Michael raised, was first raised quite eloquently by Seneca in the Roman Empire, on the ground that there were a lot of scrolls around. So there were about 200 different scrolls around to choose from. And that was already seen as creating anxiety. And he basically told young people, stick to one or two. Otherwise, you're going to get some kind of psychological mental health problem. If you look at the last 2,000 years, you'll find that virtually every moment there's a new media. You know, whether it's the reading books, the printing press, mass newspapers being created, particularly for working class people in the 19th century, is immediately raised a panic about choice, there being too much choice, that somehow we're overwhelmed. You know, what is the truth? Who you can believe and who you cannot believe. In the 19th century, there was a huge debate on how you influence public opinion. And our elites at the time were worried that their expertise would not be taken seriously. And they were discussing how can we get people to understand that they're the ones that need to be trusted. And that's a recurring theme all the time. Now, what's interesting about today is not AI or the fact that we have the internet or social media, but is a distinct moment in our time that distinguishes it from any other, is that the loss of trust which exists amongst the population coincides with a loss of elite self-belief. I think that it is interesting to know that our elites, and I hate to use to call them elites because they don't believe like a respectable elite anymore, are the ones that least believe in the truth. If you look at all the ideas about the lack of truth, about the truth being relative, the truth being fluid, it doesn't come from it doesn't come from Joe Rogan, right? It doesn't come from ordinary working class people. Questioning the truth has come from above. If you look at people who have attempted to give their version of truth, which many of us think is highly dubious, it doesn't come from bigoted people living on council estates, but it comes from elite universities, it comes from elite cultural institutions, and it comes from the fact that the elites no longer believe in the kind of truth that they peddled over centuries. I too believe in liberal elitist ideals, but who are the ones that have put the question of tolerance in the area of debate? Who are the least tolerant when it comes to a number of intellectual ideals? it is not really ordinary, bigoted, uneducated people, but it essentially comes from very highly educated Oxford, Cambridge graduates who now believe that, the truth itself is something that is very elusive and we can no longer kind of pin down. And even tolerance itself as an ideal is called into question. I remember David Cameron basically saying that we had enough of tolerance. We need to be intolerant of too much tolerance. The very idea that there could be too much tolerance, which basically means that there's too much openness to conflicting ideals, is itself a violation of the fundamental principles of classical liberalism. So all these things come from above. And it seems to me that the truth itself is being reframed and redefined by those possessing intellectual and cultural capital. Look at the way in which the question of biological sex has been now queried, that biological sex may be a mystification. We were wrong all along that there's only two sexes. Where does that come from? The Council Estates of England? Does it come from these peddlers of nasty ideas on the social media, or does it come from above? They are the ones that have called into question the past, the history of this country. They're the ones that are now revising what we think about Churchill, now revising what we think about the 19th century, the empire, and all these different things. So, you have an impulse there. And I think what was said about Gaza earlier on very eloquently explains a very important fact, that when it comes to trusting the media, I don't like Joe Rogan, to be honest. I don't like him at all. I actually believe Joe Rogan more than the BBC these days. And that's something. That wasn't the case long ago. When I was maybe 35, 40, the BBC actually was a credible source of information. Today, when I listen to the BBC on a number of issues from Ukraine to the Middle East, you have to listen very carefully because it's very tendentious and it's very selective in the way it promotes the news. So the point I'm trying to make is today we face a problem of truth and fake news, but the source of that comes from the most unlikely places, which are on the top of our society. I actually think that until this crisis of self-belief, which exists amongst our elite, is overcome, we do have a problem. Because I think, for example, James is right when he says we need something that kind of coheres us together. We need institutions to which we can all sign up to. We need to have a common story about where we come from and who we are. It's difficult to achieve, but it cannot be done unless it's actually becomes the goal that people become committed to. So what I would want to suggest is that what is really important to me at the moment is that the way we overcome the crisis of misinformation is if we honestly recognize that the quest for the truth is an important struggle, that we recognize at the moment that the truth, in the way that we see it, is something that exists in a very polarized environment. And you have to really struggle to get an insight, a glimmer into that. And to that extent, I would say that the important medium for doing that is actually the social media. Because the social media, for the first time, allows people to find their voice. People whose voice was suppressed for a long, long, long time can actually find a way of saying what they really believe in, which is messy. It's actually a very messy development. But I would rather have a very messy social media platform than one which basically prevents those voices from being heard. Because ultimately, the road to the truth comes from when people are able to open their voices to basically speak honestly. And the process of clarification and clash of opinion that comes from that is how we move forward. Thank you.
Right, it's over to you. So please put your hands up and keep them up. People with microphones. You've got up to 90 seconds. Make the points hard and good. It's not going to be messy here. We're going to be very civil, and it's a battle. But there are some rules. So let the battle begin. Gentleman here in the front.
Oh, hello. Whoopsie. Hello, yeah, my name is Gerard Hosier. I would say, James, I think your approach is very naive. I've been in the media since the late 70s. And I always question this whole thing in the 70s, which was an unusual thing to do, BBC objectivity, because objectivity is dependent on your viewpoint. And the important thing with viewpoint is setting the Overton window where the decisions for objectivity come from. So the Street of Shame, the Fleet Street, in the 70s, I don't think that anything that they generated was out of the goodness of society. It was extreme commercialism, right? But the problem with that is every morning, those newspapers would land in cabinet and they would all go through them in the morning. And that would set the Overton window for Britain for that period of time. So what I would like to just make a point is the control of the Overton window a key thing? And just one last thing.
No, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah, behind you, right behind you. We've got 2 microphones in here. Can we have one to the back? There's a gent at the back there. Yes, please, sir. Yeah, you go, sir. You. Yeah.
Reference is being made to the loss of trust in institutions, not just in the media, because trust in the media had been declining for the last 30 years, that well documented. But there's a loss of trust in government, on what government says, because a Reuters Institute, a report of a few years ago, found that 40% of the respondents found that governments, political parties and politicians were responsible for most of the misinformation that was appearing online. So the loss of trust is everywhere. And my question is, how do we begin to recover search for truth? Thank you.
Thank you. Right, gentleman at the back there. Can the microphone come to the front row to the lady there, please?
Thank you very much. Can I just say to Professor Furedi, I've heard you speak many times. That was as good as I ever heard you speak. That was fantastic. Thank you. James, I want to commend you for your courage in coming and putting this case in a room like this with people like this. That's very brave of you. But are you not betraying John Stuart Mill's central ideal, which is that the very epistemic modesty that was spoken about is what you are undermining with the claim that that there should be control of the information that people have access to. All truth claims are power claims in disguise. Are we not just seeing that being exposed possibly for the first time?
Great. So, lady, right, hands up, please. Hands up, please. So that microphone at the back goes to the lady there with her hand up. Out the front here, yes, please.
So I would like to agree about the Overton window. I think it's just worth pitching out.
Don't press anything on it. Just hold it like a bit like a pop star. That's it. Nice angle.
Okay.
Got it.
On the Overton window, yes, I agree. I think it's worth pointing out that, for example, the truth is outside the Overton window at the moment at the BBC. The truth that, say, trans women are men, that is completely outside the Overton window of the BBC at the moment. So how can we expect to trust it on anything else? But my question is, 3 journalists on my side, to Sonia, Nicole and Michael, there's kind of theoretical idea from Frank about how to test it, which find the truth, how to change this. But actually, it's 3 young journalists. How would you change this? What would you do to change this?
Whoa, that is a good question. Right, so we've got the lady at the back there, and then a gentleman there. Hey, excuse me, gentleman there at the front, and then we'll bring the panel back a bit. No, the lady at the back first. The lady at the back there who should have a microphone.
I know that. Yeah. Now I do. I just wanted to ask, because I think I kind of agree that there needs to be, the BBC can't take every position and they need to kind of decide on a line, and maybe it isn't what everyone likes. But I wonder whether the problem isn't so much that not everyone, agrees with the line that the mainstream media takes on any given issue, but that the mainstream media seems to be so afraid that people are getting information from other sources, and they're afraid that they are not able to uphold that sort of truth or ideal without kind of clamping down on anything that's going on the outside. Why is it that it seems like these institutions just they just seem insecure about being able to provide truth and, stability to a discourse landscape. And I wonder what you think about that.
Great. Gentleman there, please. Right. Hands up. If you want to speak, put your hands up. Can the microphone go at the back? Go to one of those two people there, please.
I think we've heard about the sort of government politicians giving out facts or misinformation to try and persuade us to believe them and follow them. But I think as well, if you look back into most of history, prior to Magna Carta, the king could just say, I'm doing this, and if you don't like it, I'll chop your head off. After Magna Carta, we had to persuade the barons. And as we've gone through time, we've had more and more and more expansion of suffrage to the point now where it often feels as though our politicians, they take the sort of Jack Nicholson line of you can't handle the truth. What they actually mean is, if I tell you the truth, you're not going to vote for me and you're not going to vote for my party for the next generation. So how do we get to a position where we're not being fed platitudes and misinformation because we don't have politicians afraid of getting voted out of power? They will actually tell us the truth because it's the right thing to do.
Right, we're going to have a quick comeback from the panel. Someone from the journalist quarter, please.
Yeah.
Microphone, sir.
So on the question of where do we go from here, I think posed by the Irish gentleman there and somebody else, I think instead of, there needs to be a kind of mea culpa, first of all, from the mainstream media, and to acknowledge that actually the tales they have told the public on a number of occasions in various countries have been so tall that, if you just apply a sort of Bayesian theory of probability, that they are going to be lying or distorting other things, and that actually an attitude of skepticism towards those traditional sources is actually rational. I think also, instead of demanding a return to an enforced top-down form of consensus imposed by traditional authorities, they need to acknowledge that they are now no longer referees in the game of establishing social truth. That is to say, truth which we can perhaps all aim to agree on or find consensus about. They are now contestants, and I think that's a good thing. I think that will hold them to account, and that will make them come down to earth. And I think also, lastly, more general point is, we should avoid placing too much weight on the concept of truth than it can bear. The truth is simply the current state of our knowledge on a given topic. It is prone to be updated and changed all the time, and we should bear that in mind and have some humility. Thanks.
James?
I'm intrigued to be accused of naivety. My position is actually based on incredible pessimism about human nature. I think the chaos of social media is a testament to the inability of human beings to sort out rational thought and facts when thrown together. I think the liberal values of tolerance and free speech, which are essential to a functioning democracy, I think the last 10 or 15 years have proved don't arise naturally from human beings being thrown together in a room. People are missing my point that I'm not saying that a liberal elite is a perfect system. I'm not saying it's even a good system. I'm saying that it's the system that's enabled us to have a democracy that's functioned pretty well for the last 60 years. I think probably our democracy, as we've known it, is a function of the print-based culture of newspapers and books that has, as part of its advantage as a medium of information distribution, inbuilt the hierarchy of expertise and information that is necessary for citizens to make informed democratic choices. We now have chaos of short-form video, slop, partisanship and tribalism. And I think the idea that a functioning political system will arise from that environment is the naive position, to be honest.
Frank, anyone else?
Yeah, so what we are really discussing here actually is our assessment of public opinion. Where it comes from, how it works, how it could be influenced. And it seems to me that one of the lessons of human history is that the only guarantee that we have that you have a civilized, tolerant public sphere depends upon the education, the capacity for reflection and criticism on the part of the public. I think that's really the only guarantee. There's not a guarantee. You can't rely on individuals or on institutions. At the end of the day, you have to rely upon a a cohort of individuals who are prepared to put themselves on the line, to raise uncomfortable questions, and to demonstrate the fact that they're prepared to be a little bit heretical now and again. Now, the trouble is that as we've destroyed the institutions of society, the media has already been discussed, we also undermine the system of education, the system of higher education, our level of what we expect of people growing up in terms of their intellectual outlook is far, far lower than at any other time since modern times. So therefore, it's not surprising that we live in an era of conformism, that conformism comes naturally to us. And I think the real problem for us is not that there are bad people in the media. There have always been bad people in the media. The real problem is the conformist impulse that has been set in motion within our society.
Sonia?
Yes, and picking up on that point about conformism, of course, it is very much a survival response for us as human beings as well. And I think what's been very interesting to sort of see how people have reacted to some of the most outrageous claims being posited as truths in the media has been to see a shift towards alternative voices. And there has been an absolute boon in that as well. Take the case in point of Bari Weiss, who found herself outside of the fashionable opinions at the New York Times. Now started up the Free Press, found that many people were so hungry for what she was offering. So that's a case in point.
Very good product. Yeah, it's good.
Could I just...
yeah, very quickly. Quick.
ask for a show of hands from the audience? I think this will be instructive to how the liberal elite is performing in this country. Have you heard of the name George Floyd? Please put your hands up if you have. Yes. Now, keep your hands up. And keep your hands up if you can name one victim of the grooming gang scandal in this country.
Okay.
There we have it.
Okay, right. More from the audience. First of all, at the back, Lily, you've got a couple of people at the back there. So let one of them speak first, and then Fiona will let one of the people here.
Yes, I would like to take James's sentence, which is that in a democracy, you need a shared sense of reality. I would question the idea that Britain is a democracy in the first place. You have the House of Lords, you have anti-democratic systems. I come from Switzerland, and I think Rousseau was right that you are not a democracy, but some kind of oligarchy. Therefore, it is not very confusing to see that you don't have a shared sense of reality. Secondly, on the point of reality, what is reality and what is so good about the shared sense of reality? In 1527 in Zurich, they drowned Felix Muntz, a Anabaptist, because he was for baptism of adults only. That was reality, and that was the shared sense of reality. And it is a bad reality. In other words, I don't want to live in the shared reality or the reality of the BBC. And that is the point. We need to change reality and have the right reality. Just as Britain ought to become a democracy, we need to change things, not remain with the status quo.
Good points, good hat. Can you pass the microphone for Lily? And at the front here, who's got the microphone? At the front, yes, please. Off you go.
Sonia made an interesting quote from Hannah Arendt. Disbelief in everything is replacing belief in the lie. And both those options don't sound great. But especially when you think about the context that Hannah Arendt was talking about, which was the rising tide of Nazi ideology in Weimar Germany, and the sort of some of the parallels between now and then just become more and more real by the day. But I think between the two, I think that I would prefer disbelief in everything, even though that might appear like a very dangerous void, because at least in the state of disbelief, some people might believe in any old bullshit, and we can see the chaos that James is describing on social media, but we can also see that through people getting a voice and finding their voice and being able to debate with each other on social media, that there is a really important alternative media landscape forming of centrists, of populists who are an alternative pole of attraction. And we can see that GB News, for example, is across the day starting to beat BBC news bulletins. We can see this whole manosphere. We can see this whole podcast universe. This is this is actually one of the best times that I can remember where there is such pushback against the establishment lies, and a really exciting time. So I think that this outpouring of multiple voices isn't something we should be scared of. It's something we should embrace.
Could you pass the microphone to that gentleman there? But it's, you in the middle. And then Lily, could you take the microphone right to the back on my right-hand side where people have got their hands up, please? Yeah, I see you.
Thank you. I would like the panel to comment on an idea belonging to the late great philosopher, Italian philosopher Umberto Eco, that the rise of the social media has generated an invasion of the imbeciles. Thank you.
Okay. So Fiona, could you get the microphone to that gentleman there in the blue shirt? And the microphone goes back there to the gentleman in the back who's got his hand up. And then just over there, I can see a hand up. Yep. Keep your hands up so I can see you. Yep, well, gotcha. Yep.
Nico MacDonald. There's a comment earlier on that the Reformation, the Industrial Revolution, and the rise of modern society was a product of the printing press. I think it's a very interesting and very wrong idea. And we do need to remember that it's what happens in society at a social and economic level, at the level of us as people and citizens, which makes change. In that case, it was arguably the rise of the bourgeoisie over the aristocracy, a new economic and social form, which needed the sharing of information, even if it came initially through Gutenberg and then the church and so on. And I think we need to understand what's going on in society at the moment to understand why the media is being corrupted in the way that most of our panelists have argued that it is. And it seems to me we've got a rise of the professional managerial class, which is trying to essentially usurp control of society from arguably a bourgeois capitalist class. And they live on a surplus, being managers rather than makers or creators of anything. And their truth doesn't apply to most of us. And hence they need to distort the truth in order to present the world as we are told to see it. Just to conclude on social media, I want to disagree. I think it was with James that social media, I can find an answer to something that is an argument in the truth about Maccabi Tel Aviv and Aston Villa in about 5 minutes and establish more knowledge about it than I can get from the BBC, ITV, Sky or CNN. And that is valuable. Yes, it's the rise of the idiots, but if you know who aren't the idiots, it's a lot better way to understand what's going on in the world.
Okay. Fiona, could you get that microphone and bring it back to the front here? Before I take the gentleman at the back, can I just say something? Look, you should read a newspaper, all right? Times is pretty good. Financial Times as good as even The Guardian, right? Read a newspaper. Also read Unheard. Also read Free Press. Also watch broadcasters. Read stuff. There is some pretty good stuff around at the moment. Do not write off the dead tree press. Right? Yeah, please, because it's my job. Right, gentleman at the back.
Stuart Waiton, I do work with the Scottish Union for Education, and if you want to see an education system that's going down the toilet, come to Scotland. I just wanted to ask Frank if he could clarify what he means by a kind of conformist society, because when he said it, it kind of like rang a bell. But then at the same time, you've got this term doffing the cap. And compared with kind of doffing the cap to the extent that that was ever real, it feels like, as you were saying, social media, it's the Wild West. So could you clarify what you mean by a kind of conformist culture?
Okay. Gentleman here. And then could the microphone, Lily, could the microphone at the back there go over there to the lady over there, please?
I'd just like to make a point about how media reporting is received. And a couple of days after the BBC and CNN were horribly reporting on the release of the hostages, I overheard a couple of people talking, and these were mature, educated people, that they were saying that the CNN and BBC reporting of the release was absolutely appalling. So there I am, nodding my head. It turned out they thought it was pro-Israeli.
Okay. At the back there, yes, go for it.
Yeah, you talked about the rise of social media, meaning we don't have a shared reality, but my kids are at a very multicultural school in West London, and I first noticed during the war in Syria that when we were talking about whether or not Assad had used chemical weapons against his people, that some of the parents were watching Russia Today, some were watching the Islam Channel, some watch Al Jazeera, Press TV. I've done a study on one of these channels, and I know that there's very low standards of sourcing and rigor around the truth on at least one of them. Is there a role for a beefed up? Is there a place for a beefed up role for Ofcom in monitoring the output of these channels?
Okay, the microphone go across there to in the middle, someone there in a white t-shirt, hands up. Fiona, could you give the microphone to this gentleman here with the sunglasses on his shirt? You can speak first, sir. You.
A quick question for the panel. What do you think would happen to the concept of truth and society more broadly if all news media, all journalism was suddenly, for argument's sake, removed, disappeared? What would society collapse? Would we find our own truth? What would happen?
Okay, at the back there.
There's a strange outpouring of mawkishness in this room towards social media. I can't help but notice that. I don't know. I don't think you really know what you're getting yourselves in for. I mean, I think, I hate to say this room is a little bit older than the current generation coming up, which use social media a heck of a lot more than all of you do. Reality is no longer combined. I think the naive position goes to everybody who believes that more voices is more good. And, that's one thing, but we haven't even glimpse the idea of AI in all of this. I mean, we think about AI as nothing more than, a text machine. The rise of Sora is going to make images online incredibly hard to tell what's real anymore. And in that environment, with what is real and what isn't real, with what are bots and what are real people, more voices are not good voices. So be careful what you invite yourself in for.
Okay. I'm going to bring some panel voices in now, Frank.
Well, the question of what is real and what isn't real was raised when the printing press was invented. And people began to produce these indexes of books that have been published. And many of these indexes gave false information about the content of the books that were being published in Europe at that time. And this was the first time there's a crisis of what is real and what isn't real. And it seems to me that the issues that we're raising about AI are no different. We think that we live in a world that is so extremely complicated and complex compared to anything that people experienced in the past, that we forget that for a human being living in the 15th century, being confronted with 200, 300 books was overwhelming. It was totally overwhelming. And people talked about the illnesses that people suffered, the anxiety that people suffered from the book. So we need to have a historical perspective because we flatter ourselves as living in this very unique period. And we forget the fact that there's nothing unique about it. Can I just say one thing? When Umberto Eco talks about imbeciles, I think that's a statement about himself. Because I think it's very easy to make those kinds of statements about people who are less educated than we are. It's very easy to look down and patronize people and not understand that many people are struggling to understand the world around them. And in the course of struggling, you are going to say silly things. You are going to express prejudices of various sorts. And I think we have to be, we have to take a reality check and ask the questions, today in the 21st century, who are the real imbeciles? As a university professor, I can tell you that many of them inhabit institutions of higher education. They may have PhDs, but when you actually talk to them, you realize that they are a bunch of schmucks. I mean, essentially. You have a situation where when you talk to our civil servants these days, you can tell exactly what they're going to say before they open their mouths. That to me is a sign of an imbecile who's been programmed to basically say stuff without thinking about it. And I think we have to be a bit more democratic in the way we understand the human conditions rather than look down upon people who just make silly mistakes now and again.
Nicole?
I agree with Frank that a lot of these problems stem from universities and this idea of no debate that we've seen playing across universities in particular. The other day I was at an event about sexual violence that happened on October 7, and there was a huge crowd outside shouting Zionists off our campus. And that's where we are. And there are people that I've met in this room, and we've met because you for quite a long time you weren't allowed to say in public that a woman is a human adult female. And I think that social media has helped push that along. And I think also, as has been said in this room, a lot of important debate is happening on social media. Before I write an op-ed, I'll often pose the question on social media. So I have a really good look at what people want to say about certain things and to help me put together my arguments. So I think that, I suppose, I'm a real centrist, so I kind of believe that we have to work together in terms of social media, traditional media, and I also want to please buy a newspaper. We are dying, and although there are problems within our media, a newspaper like the Times, they did help massively expose the grooming gangs at a time when most places wouldn't, where it wouldn't be touched, where the police wouldn't touch it. The same with some of the newspapers talking about the gender critical, the gender madness, that kind of thing. There is a pushback on the pro-Palestine push that's of the BBC against this activism. So I think that social media does help push the Overton window over what we're allowed to discuss. And if we just left it to the liberal elites who were pushed into this no debate at universities, then we would be in much more trouble.
If you go back and read about the period in Britain, it was a period called the Six Acts. It was after the Peterloo massacre. They were very worried about the unlicensed press, and there was something that was called the penny libel. They didn't pretend to be like, the Times, a very august newspaper. It was a libel. They were usually very, very scurrilous, very, very polemical. It was sold for a penny. People used to go to prison for circulating these libels because it was against the law under the Six Acts. And there's a great case which you can read about. It's in E.P. Thompson. Joseph Stam in Macclesfield. He gets another 2.5 years for circulating libels, and he was proud about the fact they were libels, printed libels. And he said, what, 2.5 years? You're going to have to hang me if you want to stop me. And nothing the judges could do. They had to back off. They didn't really want to start hanging people for libels. Right, there.
Hi. My issue, I guess, is more about we have a government that seems to be hated, where the word lies come up every day. And I just feel that with the press, I'd like to see, cake was such a big issue back in the day, but we just don't, it just doesn't feel like our reporters or our journalists on BBC, Sky News and the newspapers are really pursuing, or I don't know, I just worry that we're giving people you guys seem to pick and choose who you give a hard time to. And that's the bias that I see. And just one other point, we were in Israel last week and saw the release of the hostages. And I've got to tell you, the reporting from the BBC and Sky was appalling.
You've also got to ask questions. There's a lot of places in Britain right now where there are no reporters. If you want to know what's going on in a local town hall nowadays, you look on Facebook or you look on the blogs. Right, lady at the back there.
Hello there. My awakening came in under COVID when I found that we had the science trademark, which has never been in place before. So you had people like the Great Barrington Declaration. You had John Campbell, a nurse practitioner for 40 years, Pierre Corey, who gave a talk to the Senate, US Senate, on the efficiency of ivermectin. Peter McCullough, the most credentialed haematologist. Tess Lawrie, who had formerly worked for the WHO. None of them were being talked about. And so that was the first thing. And secondly, as regards the grooming gang, I think people should be aware of people like Raja Mia, who is an amazing Substack. And also with George Floyd, you could look up Tony Timper, and actually The Guardian, even in 2016, because exactly the same thing happened to him, and he was a white guy, and I had a dispute with the BBC, emails back and forth, about why didn't you actually mention George Floyd was not the first person to die in this way, and the people who, the police involved with Tony Timper actually got off. Nobody knows about that. And finally, just to say to Frank, the national curriculum, critical thinking, is now only mentioned in 2 subjects, that's art and design and history, and we are doing a real disservice to our young people.
Okay, can you pass the microphone to that young gentleman next to you? Get your hands up if you want to speak. Get your hands up. There's someone at the back there, standing behind a pillar, which isn't good. Come out from where you're hiding. Yes, no, yeah, go the other way towards the mic. Right, off you go.
Hi. On James's point, are we not forgetting the great virtue of free speech and more speech, that allowing more speech also allows the idiots to expose themselves? For example, Bob Dylan, if we cut his broadcast, he'd still be parading as this anti-establishment hero. Well, he still is, but and Candace Owens is somehow blaming Charlie Kirk's death on the IDF. And not that I've really listened to either of those voices before, but I'm sure a lot of people have stopped listening to their voices since. And by censoring any voices on these platforms, podcasts as Joe Rogan, we allow for these people to be listened to more than you get the point.
Good point. Yes.
Hi. Was a very mature student at university, and what I'm concerned with is what I've seen is that when they want sources, but they tend to promote The Guardian. I've done like an undergraduate and just finished a master's, but it's The Guardian that's promoted by the universities, and it doesn't tend to be the Times. You don't tend to, you can't access the Telegraph. So that, if you want to promote our media today, then higher education needs to allow students, our young people, to access them across the board.
Thank you very much. Could we have one of the microphones coming for his second bite at the cherry? This gentleman here. Get your hands up. It's more or less your last chance, or forever hold your peace. Microphone to this gentleman here, but stick your hand up, please. Have I know? Thanks.
Yeah, sorry, back again. Michael's question got me thinking there as to...
Speak into the mic.
Yeah, Michael, hold it like a pop star.
With that?
Yeah.
Michael's question has got me thinking there as to what actually is a truth and how do we define it and prevent it from becoming something it isn't. In asking who knew of George Floyd, and then asking who could name a victim of the grooming gangs, personally, I think all that really shows is that you recognise an individual, whereas you won't necessarily recognise an individual within a group. So people will remember who Stephen Lawrence was, for example, because he was an individual. Everybody kept their hands up as to, yeah, we know who the grooming gangs were and what the horror was. Can you really draw a truth out of not being able to name one individual amongst many of the victims versus one victim of one individual event?
Right, can you put the microphone there to the gentleman there? Yep.
Has the battle of ideas become a bit of an echo chamber?
An echo chamber.
An echo. Yeah, because I've been really appalled to hear what seems to be the universal opinion throughout this whole audience in favour of, broadly speaking, Nicole's position on, the BBC in relation to Palestine, even from the Zero representative who spoke very well and to the point, but we didn't hear anything to contradict or to challenge the idea that the BBC is very pro-Palestine. Surely, well, has it? That's my question. Has the battle of ideas become an echo chamber?
Okay, can you pass the microphone to the woman in front of you? Hopefully she won't echo you. And then we've got Lily. Could you get the microphone to the back there? Scottish guy again, I think.
My point is very brief, and it refers again to this question of the grooming gangs and George Floyd, is that one of the ways that truth has been kind of misrepresented over a decade is the adoption of the lived experience kind of journalism, which doesn't tell a truth, it tells someone's truth. So we have not had the lived experience of a grooming gang survivor for example, on the BBC, or we haven't had, for example, these detransitioners or the child of a transitioned father, or they pick and choose the lived experiences, and that informs a lot of the bias.
Yep, you. And then can the microphone go over there to the lady in the striped top?
Just because it's been raised, there's a very interesting Dutch paper it's around senseless violence. And the point he makes related to the George Floyd thing is the real change is that in the past, we used to remember the villains like Myra Hindley and so on because society had a kind of moral framework, moral compass, and it would cohere itself around the villains. Whereas today, we hardly remember the villains, but we remember the victims, because that taps into our more individuated, fearful sensibility. But nothing coherent comes out of that. There's just a sense of anxiety and fear, because society's lost its capacity to have a kind of moral framework to which to hold up the demons, the folk devils, if you like.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Does that work? Sorry. Yes, I'm a bit surprised anyone's watching the BBC anymore. I got rid of my licence 4 years ago after COVID. What are we going to do about it is the question. I've trained as a documentary filmmaker using my mobile phone. My mission statement is to outdo the BBC's old quality of programmes. We could all flood the internet with really valid, high standard programmes now because of the technology and AI. Can we take this opportunity?
Right. Okay. I'm going to bring the panel to sum up.
Could I respond to this?
No, because you've got a chance to sum up, haven't you? Okay. So you can do it when you sum up. But I get them to sum up. They can sum up 3 minutes. So I'm very generous. In the order they spoke. So James, you're summing up.
Yeah, well, I'm very aware that my position is doomed, and I know that the mainstream media is doomed. The concept of objective truth is doomed, and I think we can already see that the consequences are going to be pretty severe. We can see what's happening in America. There's democratic backsliding, and I'm not sure that democracy will survive the advent of social media and the chaos that it brings. I know that I'm almost alone in this room thinking this, but we're going to see it unfold, I think, in my lifetime. I think a lot of people criticizing newspapers don't open newspapers and don't look at the reporting in them. I think maybe people aren't aware that the grooming gangs story was on the front page of the Times again and again and again a few years ago when it first broke. I think the idea that a medley of voices is going to allow the best ideas to rise to the top and the worst ideas to be exposed for the frauds that they are is nonsense. Candace Owens, far from being exposed as an idiot, is among the most popular broadcasters in America. And I think there's an incredible amount of totally misguided optimism about the power of social media. It's not a neutral platform. It's guided by algorithms, which are controlled by some of the most powerful people in the world. You think your voice is maybe being heard on the merit of your opinions. The opinions that are heard on social media are those that appeal to the algorithm because they promote rage, they promote strong negative emotional reactions, and those reactions are promoted on social media because we know that the angrier and the more unhappy people are, the more time they spend on their screens. And the ultimate aim of Silicon Valley is to make you spend as much time on your screen as possible so that you can see more ads, so the algorithm can track and serve you better ads. That's what social media is for. It's not an instrument of truth. I know I'm the only person who believes this, but newspapers do want to inform you. And yeah, I think what's going to happen in our society will be very unfortunate. And I think I'll be proven right in the long term. But whether anyone will agree with me, I'm quite pessimistic.
Just to emphasise again, you don't have to believe in the abolition of social media or having Silicon Valley police social media to believe in curated journalistic comment products such as Unheard, Dispatch, Free Press, newspapers as well. So remember that. They're very important. Use them, pay for it. Nicole.
Just to add to what the two of you have said, as a print journalist, I want to emphasise the importance of newspapers. And while we've been talking a lot, attacking the media, a lot of that is about the BBC, which is different, really, because we all have to pay for the BBC if we want to watch it. And, you know, one of the interesting facts I discovered is that 750,000 people cancelled their licence fee just last year. So clearly what they're showing us and what they're pushing at us isn't good enough. I want to just address the Bob Vylan point, because there are a couple of things to do with that in terms of after Bob Vylan's appearance on the BBC, anti-Semitism spiked for the next 2 days. That's how dangerous the BBC is. And there is a question for us outside of the media in terms of whether we shut people up or not. You know, NECAP is an example of that. And part of that journalism is about telling the story correctly. So they weren't being, there wasn't allegations against them because they were pro-Palestine, but because they were pro a terrorist organisation, which goes back to the point I'm trying to emphasise, which is our media has to push and describe Hamas as a terrorist group. And if it doesn't do that, then we get confusion. I don't know how we solve this problem. Ofcom isn't strong enough, and there are some newspapers that literally mark their own homework, such as The Guardian and The Independent, because after Leveson, what the Press Complaints Commission was closed, and there's no oversight of it. But I suppose the other question is, if there is oversight, do we trust the overseers? And that takes us to the heart of the establishment and who is telling the narrative. And that's why I think having many more voices on social media are really important.
Okay, I just want to say something very quickly about Bob Vylan. So Bob Vylan did a concert in Amsterdam, and very luckily there was a journalist in the audience from the Telegraaf newspaper who took footage of what was going on. There was also a young man there from the Jewish Council, and they were threatened while they were taking video. And I would recommend. I think the video of Bob Vylan doing the chat shit, get banged comments about Charlie Cook should actually be watched everywhere. And it's a real credit to those people. One, an activist, the other, a journalist. But we even know about that outside the little echo chamber of Bob Vylan fans. Michael.
Thank you. I'd like to just finish on 3 anecdotes or stories to just concretize this idea of the liberal elite and exactly what they've been up to in recent years. When Angela Merkel unilaterally opened Germany's borders to what turned out to be over 1 million asylum seekers in 2015, one of the first things she did was call in the heads of German newspapers and later the heads of social media companies, asking them to censor some of the more heated criticism of that policy. Now, what were the results of that policy, which, by the way, proved extremely unpopular among the German people? A year after, there was a surge in violent crime, a spate of sexual assaults, and Germany, for the first time in its history, now needs armed guards to patrol Christmas markets to prevent Islamist atrocities. Now, perhaps as a result of Miss Merkel's gatekeeping operation, when 1,200 women were sexually assaulted in one night on New Year's Eve in 2015 in central Cologne, the German people had to wait several days to even find out about it. This is unprecedented in German history. It's in recent German history, that is. Don't forget about the Russians.
Always be careful.
Okay, so unlike Merkel's use of the term misinformation, Merkel used the term misinformation as a way to effectively place a gagging order against the German public for a policy that she unilaterally implemented. Second point is, in Canada in 2021, the entire liberal elite was taken in by a false story about dead Aboriginal children being found at a state-run school. Justin Trudeau's government quickly declared this a genocide. It was unanimously voted through in Parliament, to rapturous applause from the press gallery, which James seems to place a lot of faith in. They would have given North Korea a run for its money on that. It turned out to be displaced dirt was what they were really what they had found. Lastly, a debate emerged on social media earlier this year on X about the grooming gangs. Now, I take the point that this was covered in the Times, and with the honourable exception of Andrew Norfolk, who did extremely good work on this. It wasn't very widely covered by journalists at all, and the full scale of the crime was never reported. It's like seeing the tail of an elephant, but not the full thing. I'll just finish on this. If that debate and the content moderator of that debate had consulted the traditional sources of authority on what was true with relation to the grooming gangs, which, by the way, in my view, is the biggest scandal in recent British history, is he would have found on Wikipedia that the Muslim grooming gangs is a moral panic propagated by right-wing activists, The Rest is Politics, our most popular politics podcast, would have inaccurately assured him that the attacks took place in only 2 cities and young girls were paid for sex. They in fact took place in over 50 towns and villages that we know of, and many of the girls were underage, therefore not able to give consent. I could go on, but I'd like to finish just this is the liberal elite in action, and so thank God that we have a bottom-up mechanism to hold them to account.
Sonia.
Oh, I'll be quite brief about this. Going back to how does one resolve this situation, and I stated before that I don't think an extra layer of bureaucracy, which is mirroring sort of already comfortable ideas and notions, and people who are yes people put into those roles to police how editorial controls are fought through. But I do believe also that it just boils down to one thing: human skepticism. And in all this debate about AI, you can wrestle with the fact that AI has its limits. It's a beautiful mirror. We can look into it and it presents situations. It's very effective. But this conversation that we're having about AI is going to be dwarfed in comparison when we start having very serious conversations about AGI, artificial general intelligence. And I think the moment now we have to be focused on really putting in as much diverse content there, all these different voices and experiences, shed light everywhere, no matter how troubling we may find them, no matter how distasteful we find them. We need to have a record of all these voices, because this is what diversity actually means. Not groupthink, but the sum of all of our experiences. And we are, in effect, creating what is going to be AGI in the future, which is apparently only about 7 years away.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I don't have a problem with liberal elites, mainly because there is no such thing as a liberal elite in the 21st century. They're conspicuously illiberal. If you look at the values that they uphold, they violate every single foundational value of liberalism, from tolerance onwards. And I think that's quite important to realize, that what we have is a very illiberal, authoritarian-minded group of people whose instincts are not one of genuine commitment to the pursuit of the truth. I think that, contrary to what James says, he's not alone. And we keep on saying that you're alone, but actually, the views you express about democracy is now the mainstream within political theory and within universities. I've just written an article on my Substack, which was published yesterday. It's called Roots and Wings with Frank Furedi, which is really about the way in which a loss of faith in democracy has now become symptomatic of the general outlook, the intellectual outlook that prevails within people who are in the old legacy establishment, for very good reasons. Because what we're really discussing, the dilemma that we're discussing, is that the legacy establishment has lost its capacity to influence events through the media. Its media is no longer able to be trusted. And I think because the legacy establishment and the legacy media is no longer regarded in the same kind of a way, it's allowed other voices to be heard, which is, I think, really positive. I don't want to sound like an echo chamber, but I try to be critical. And I know there are some very good programs on Radio 4, for example, on BBC. And I'm always open to the idea that some of these reporters are really brilliant. But on Palestine, every time Jeremy Bowen opens his mouth, I mean, I don't know if you ever listened to the guy, that kind of sanctimonious bullshit that he kind of comes out with, I just reach for my metaphorical AKA, which I kind of imagine. And I think it's a tragedy, because it seems to me that at one time the BBC was really one of the best outlets in the world. Can I just say to everybody, read newspapers. I think it's really quite important, because in every newspaper there's always a gem of interesting ideas. And your job is to be like intellectual miners, that you try to unearth who are the good columnists, who are the people that are providing you with good information. And that's the key to success. That's what we all got to learn to do, to educate ourselves in this very confusing period that we're facing.
Yeah, buy people like a subscription for Christmas. You know, like to Unheard or whatever it is.
Or
or
Russo wins the
Spectator
Furedi.
yeah, well, yeah. Could everyone give a round of applause for our panel, please?